Eric,
Omar,
where are we right now?
you and Dr. Patroklos Androulakis-Korakakis are chilling in Toronto while I am here just wishing I was there in Toronto, but I'm not. I'm in New Zealand.
Well, Pak, as I understand it, Eric, you're a top-level coach. You're going to IPF Worlds once again to coach the Jessica Bittner, where she's going to attempt to, defend her title in Malta, which is actually just a stone's throw away from where Pak, not trying to bring up your ancestry right now, but where he's from, Greece. And I understand that Pak is going to Greece around that time. So, Pak, welcome back to the podcast. Will you be attending IPF Worlds?
I thank you for having me on. Hello to the viewers and the listeners. Hello, viewers and listeners from a beautiful Toronto here with Omar Yusuf. I will not be attending IPF Worlds. I'll be attending a different event, a meetup with a single individual who arguably is stronger than all the contenders of the IPF World competition put together. Kyriakos Grizzly. You heard it here first. I'll be visiting him to get a training session in and meet in person. So, yeah, IPF Worlds, cute, squat, bench, whatever the other lift is. Kyriakos Grizzly pulling 600 kilos on I think, handmade sort of construction with a rope. Arguably better, more entertaining, and more functional, which is a word we love here on Iron Culture, and we use quite a bit. And
All I have to say to that is,
Eric, actually, you'll like this. And folks, there are timestamps. Shout out to Kai because you can't skip ahead. It is relevant to the topic we will be discussing today, but you would find this entertaining, Eric, because you've been to Force Fitness as well. I went with Pak. We were crushing it, training, lifting, doing our thing, asserting dominance. And Pak heard twice. Eric, I don't know what has transpired. It's not an attack on Force. I'm just saying gyms in general. But someone brought up something about training to Pak. Pak's a newcomer to the gym. Something about functional.
No, I remember.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was like, oh, is there no Smith machine here? Obviously, as growing up as barbell purists, we know that the Smith machine is the worst thing to ever exist because stability and other words that intuitively make some sense. So I mentioned Smith machine, and an individual was like, yeah, none of that S here. It's only for bodybuilding and it's not functional. And I was doing a lat pull down. And while doing the lat pull down, I was like, F it. And I went, define functional. And then they were like, what? And I was like, yeah, I agree. It's not functional. So I chickened out, but that was it.
I like it. The grunted cough. Did he ask me a question? No, of course I did not. Thank you, sir. I'm a newcomer here. Decision. Probably the best one. Of course, if you were just to simply get up and then deadlift 600 pounds, you could ask whatever questions you'd want. And then they would look at you and ask questions about, hey, like, what should I do with my lunch, bro? And what do you think about the DUP? And
one of my favorite drugs.
All of a sudden, yes, DNP, DUP, same thing. And you would all of a sudden be atop the pyramid on that day, able to give advice. And that's a good segue, by the way, because there is a difference between being strong and then being at the peak of your possible strength in specific movements. And I think this is a good conversation about specificity that we could have.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who don't know, Pak's back on. This is great. Mm-hmm. Now he's a multi-time guest. And one of the things we did not talk about when we had you on last time, we primarily talked about minimum effective dose training as well as deloads. But there's a really cool research study that you were a part of that specifically looked at the strength of powerlifters in a more isolated position than you'd expect. Isolated lumbar extension compared to deadlifts. And I think this is a great way to discuss a perhaps surprising aspect of just how specific strength is. Mm-hmm. So Pak, if you don't mind, with that great lead-in, we talked about Kyriakos Grizzly. We talked about you chickening out at Fortis. We talked about the fact that you've got an over 600-pound deadlift. We talked about the fact that you're blowing off IPF Worlds despite the fact that I'm there, but honestly, it's Grizzly, I understand. So, talk to us about this study.
The blowing off and I'm there part, there were many puns there that I will let the viewers come up with themselves. This was actually the second study I ever did. And this was a study led by me as part of my, I guess, passion for research. When I finished my undergrad, I told James Steele, Professor James Steele, hey, James, love this research thing. Is there anything we could look at? And he had specifically done his PhD on lumbar extension strength, low back pain, training the lower back, and so on and so forth. And at Solon University, we have a machine called the Medix lumbar extension machine, which you had a chance to try. And you had the James Steele explanation of piece, which was like you pressed play at a recording and he went over the machine, all the procedures, how it works. Essentially, for the viewers and listeners, it's a machine that restrains your pelvis and allows you to completely isolate your lower back, so that your hamstrings and glutes are not really doing anything, and it's just your lumbar extensors that are doing the work. And what I thought would be interesting to look at is in powerlifting and in strength sports, we often talk about the lower back strength and accessory work, or just work in general to increase that. We talk about the deadlifts being a lower back exercise that gets your lower back stronger. So I wanted to look at the two different populations and their lower back strength, how it compares, and whether there are any variables or covariates that would predict lower back strength in powerlifters and other individuals. So what we did is I recruited a bunch of competitive and non-competitive powerlifters, and I tested them on that machine. So we did testing isometrically at 5 to 7 different angles. The angles were determined by the size of the powerlifter. Some people were able to reach lower. Some people were able to not reach lower because they were bigger, including myself. I was only able to do 5 angles because I was quite the chubby boy back then. And we looked at the powerlifters and compared them with the subjects of a previous study that was done by James Fisher, which essentially looked at whether people training on that particular machine and doing dynamic repetitions and that full range of motion instead of isometrics at different angles, whether that strength would transfer to Romanian deadlift strength versus a group that was doing just Romanian deadlifts and nothing else. I'm saying a lot. I will summarize quickly. So powerlifters versus people who were just recreationally training and doing the Romanian deadlift. And we wanted to see how those two compared as far as low back strength went. So that was the basic design of the study. The study is out there and it's called Comparison of Isolated Lumbar Extension Strength in Competitive and Non-Competitive Powerlifters and Recreationally Trained Men. Any questions thus far?
Yeah, who's the first author on that?
Me.
Well done, sir. And Kai will now appreciate the fact that we covered that because he won't have to search very hard to find that for the timestamps. One little thing I think I will add, just to give the listener a little more context, as someone who experienced this recently, after I found out I was 17.4% body fat, or actually before I found out I was 17.4% body fat. So there's no order effect because that depressed me. So I probably did a good job on the back extension. It's the Medix. That's the brand of it. Yeah. So it's a Medix isolated lumbar extension. And it's pretty cool because I think even more than doing, say, one of the back extension machines like Cybex or something you might find in the gym, and even then a step further more than, say, doing a back extension on like a 45-degree free weight setup, this does a really good job of isolating the position you're in. It locks your legs in, it locks your upper body in, it's customized to your individual limb lengths and proportions and body. And then what Pak was referring to is that you actually go through a tested range of lumbar flexion and extension to see what your endpoint ranges of motion are. So just like Pak, he only had 5 angles. Like I said, I was 17.4% body fat, so I had 2 angles that were tested. I could barely bend over before my gut was actually spilling over my knees and actually touching my calves.
No.
I shouldn't call them calves, my cankles. So essentially what it is looking at is you can actually see your own force curve and the amount of torque, I should say, that you're producing at each one of those different joint angles that you can get to, which is kind of cool. So anyway, highly isolated, you would think, quote unquote, non-skilled movement versus something like an RDL. And I think it's a really cool comparison between those groups. And I personally was surprised by the findings, and I'll leave that seed, that excitement, I'll plant it, and you continue, Pak.
Awesome. Just wanted to add that the rationale behind doing the study wasn't just, hey, let's see what powerlifters can do on this particular machine. But the findings of that previous Fisher study were what led to the study, which I should have mentioned. So essentially what Fisher did is he had two groups. One group was training on that machine dynamically, so going through a full range of motion, and another group training the RDL. The group that trained just the RDL increased their RDL strength, but the group that trained on the lumbar extension machine increased both their strength on the machine and their RDL strength, despite not performing any RDL-specific training. Obviously, that's just one study, right? I'm not saying, hey, stop doing deadlifts and go buy yourself a Medix, but that's what led to this this sort of further exploration of whether powerlifters who do train the deadlift and the squat, the low bar squat, the high bar squat, most of their training time, whether those lifts actually have any carryover to lumbar extensor strength. So the findings were essentially there were no differences between the recreationally active individuals who did train the RDL and those and the powerlifters. We asked, as I was a powerlifter myself at the time, I asked a bunch of questions to see whether we could predict a lower back strength from any other covariates like deadlift stance, conventional, sumo, squat bar position, low bar, high bar, whether they used a belt, whether they didn't, whether they used PDs or did not, and whether they also did lower back accessory work during their training. And the only thing that was actually able to predict their strength was just their body weight. The rest didn't really matter that much. And allow me to note that the findings of the study didn't receive much attention, but they were misrepresented in some circles as the squat and the deadlift doesn't train your lower back. But in reality, the scores that the powerlifters achieved in comparison to the scores that the recreationally active individuals that trained the RDL achieved were high. It's just that the powerlifters didn't have higher scores. So it may be that after a certain point of training the powerlifts, you can't, you'd have to really isolate the lower back to make that even stronger. So it wasn't like the powerlifters were weak. They were strong. It's just that they weren't even stronger. You know, like if we were to compare, I don't know, a bone density between powerlifters and rugby players, and found that they both had very high bone mineral density, but the powerlifters didn't have higher. That doesn't mean that, you know, the analogy was bad. You know what I mean? Iron culture.
Yeah. So well done. No. So just to clarify, we've got both groups training. They're just doing different training. How much training experience do the non-powerlifters have with training in general and with specifically the Medix machine? How much training had they done? If we want to look at these two groups to think like, okay, how much time doing resistance training more broadly did each group have?
That is a good question, and I will have to remind myself how much training they had. In that meantime, Omar will fill in the gap with some elevator music.
Yeah, this is totally not me just filling the time while Pak takes a look. I will say, Eric, that it is very nice to see. I now understand how you guys do the podcast because I have OBS open at all times, which means I'm just always looking at you. If I want to, verify something, I have to look at the phone, which, it kind of looks at the viewer like I'm looking away, and that's disrespectful, so I tend not to do it. But I see Pak here. He's taking a look right at the research, and how useful is this when you bring it up and you could see all the figures and you could quote it reliably. Now, Eric, I just assume, because I see sometimes your eyes reading the lines, I'm like, oh, this is all from Eric's memory, where he's like, oh, yeah, it's like, and it's 3.4. It's one big charade. This is a Wizard of Oz moment where we get behind the scenes, and it's nothing but another man.
No, I tell you what, like, while Pak was talking, I was looking up a study because I couldn't quite remember the results, but it is by Rossi and colleagues. I knew that, so I could look it up. But no, if I don't actually remember the percentage change in studies that were conducted in 2018 off the top of my head, so I do have to look them up. I am but a mere mortal, and I think we've filled the space now.
Yeah,
Pak, tell us about the training experience comparing these two groups.
Awesome timing. To my defense, this was done like almost 7 years ago, and because the recreationally active individuals were not people I tested, they were from a previous study, I get the pass. So they had to have greater than 2 years of resistance training experience and not be participating in a resistance training program that included any specific lumbar exercises or the RDL itself. So
Got it.
they trained the RDL as part of the intervention, and we compared the post data, essentially how strong they got after the intervention, after training with the RDL, to the baseline strength of the powerlifters.
And I think that's a really important point, Pak, because it speaks to the idea that getting incredibly strong, like on the level of where you're a powerlifter on a given lift, is probably a little more specific than we give it credit for, especially in circles where you might be like a trainer who thinks, hey, like strength is the cornerstone of everything, and that there's this linear relationship between the stronger you get, the healthier you are, the better you are, and like you'll be better off with a 600-pound squat than a 500-pound squat. And I think the reality is probably a little different than that. So I'll again, I'm just planting seeds, and we're going to watch this garden grow later in the episode. But Pak, take it from here. Talk to us more about these results.
Yeah. So as you said, it appears that when talking about lumbar extension strength specifically, increasing your squat further, or because obviously these powerlifters, I think, and I'll hit you with the specific strength number. So their average squat and deadlift 1RM. So their deadlift was right around 200 kilos for the non-competitive powerlifters. The competitive powerlifters had a mean deadlift of 230 kilos, and the squat for the non-competitive powerlifters was around 180 and around 215 kilos for the competitive lifters. So the idea, and when you look at the RDL strength or just the general strength of the recreationally active individuals, they were nowhere near those numbers. So the idea that if you are specifically training for 1 repetition maximum strength and seeing your squat and deadlift go up, that will indefinitely get your lower back stronger, and you're just going to be getting stronger and stronger and stronger, does not seem to be entirely true. It may be, obviously strength is multifactorial and there's many different variables that come into play, but it may be more of a case where you're getting better at the actual test rather than your lower back and your overall structure becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. And we see that as well with powerlifters and muscle growth, specifically after a certain point. So after you've been powerlifting for a specific amount of time, you may see your strength go up, but you're not gaining pounds and pounds of muscle as the years go by.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good study to contrast with the study I mentioned earlier for our Fill the Airspace conversation of how I was looking up Rossi and colleagues. And first, I'm just going to present the findings of this study before I talk about the nuance, just so people can be like, what? Why is these two things seem different? And the study is Strength, Body Composition, and Functional Outcomes in the Squat versus Leg Press Exercises by Rossi and colleagues. This was originally published in 2016, but went full to press in 2018. And essentially what they did is they took a group of nearly 30 untrained individuals, key point there, and they split them up into either a leg press only group, a squat only group, or a leg press squat group, and trained them for, I think, 8 weeks. And then they just simply looked at the changes in 1RM in the squat and the leg press, which they pre and post tested. So that means that the squat group only got to do the leg press pre and post. The leg press group only got to do the squat pre and post. And then they looked at the percentage change, differences between groups, and they also looked at centimeters of maximal jump height, that's the quote-unquote functional outcome in this study. And I think some things made a lot of sense in this study. Like if you look at the leg press group, they only increased their squat by 8%. And that was like a small effect size. And it was significantly less than both the squat group and the leg press plus squat group. However, they increased their leg press strength 34%, and that was a pretty damn large effect size. And the very small improvement in their jump height of only 3%. So again, the leg press really seemed to primarily enhance the leg press, exactly as you'd expect. However, the squat-only group, they improved their squat 31.5% and their leg press 34%. So it's very, very similar increase in leg press strength in the group that only squatted, and they also had a 9% increase in their jump height. And then the leg press plus squat group, they had basically the dead middle in terms of their improvement in their squat strength, of just short of 20% between the other two groups. But they also had a similar improvement in leg press strength of 31%. So what we're seeing here is that the more specific movement that contains the same joint angles, contains the same range of motion, trains the same muscle groups, the squat, transfers really well to the leg press, and that you really don't need to specifically do the leg press, this simple movement, this machine movement, and you transfer quite well. But that's not exactly what you guys found. And I think the key difference here is that we're looking at untrained individuals. And so I think this gets to your point, and kind of the meta conversation that we want to have is that there is a limit to the benefit you can get from being stronger. And in the S&C world, when I've talked to savvy coaches, they think about what are the force demands, the specific joint angles and the types of force demands, the type of force even. Is it more eccentric? Do they need to have a more yielding force? Is it isometric? Is it mostly only concentric? That they need in their sport, at the most demanding sessions. And then they think of, all right, well, how can my training help me in this? And there are many strength coaches who I respect to be like, I really don't see the point in getting my athletes squatting more than 2 or 3 plates, right? Because that is more than they're ever going to move, at least at that velocity, or at least at those joint angles, et cetera, et cetera. And it is the powerlifters who think they're strength coaches who kind of just see it as, well, all right, I need to move you up in performance, and right now you're squatting 400. I'm sure it's going to be 450 that moves the needle and is better. And I will say, just to one caveat to people who don't understand the S&C world, typically the metrics that you're evaluated on are gym metrics, jump height, your vertec. Can you touch higher? Are you increasing your beep test, or your 505, or just your 40-meter, sprint, or your squat 1RM, or your clean 1RM, or what have you? Because it's almost impossible to be like, oh yeah, I'm pretty sure that the game we won on Saturday was due to these 3 players who I'm training and the training we did. So sometimes a S&C coach, despite knowing better, will focus on these objective gym metrics. And sometimes that includes increasing 1RM, even though they may not be convinced it's enhancing performance. So that is kind of a whole other, what is being rewarded, what's incentivized in the S&C world. But there are plenty, unfortunately, S&C coaches who probably think that what they're doing is going to have a linear and more direct enhancement of performance, even though I think it's very difficult to argue that from a specificity standpoint. And that's what this study really gets to, in my mind, Pak, is it shows that, hey, all of these people in this study have trained lumbar extension one way or another and have gotten quite strong. And if we want to see lumbar extension go up even further, you might need to be specific to lumbar extension, not just an RDL, which, by the way, RDL is a compound movement. It's performed differently. You ran the study, Pak. How did you guys have them perform the RDL? What did that look like? What was the actual movement parameter so everyone's on the same page?
So that was the study by Fisher. I only did the testing on powerlifters, so that was James Fisher a few years back. I could describe the procedures now off the top of my head, where I am looking at a Romanian deadlift picture on the Fisher paper, but yeah, I can't tell you off the top of my head. I will need a second and tell you how James actually performed the RDL. But from what I remember, there was nothing unconventional about it, if that makes sense.
Got it. I like the pun there, unconventional. The only reason I ask is because some people will perform it without allowing any knee unlock. Some people perform it from the ground. Some people perform it out of the rack and start with the eccentric. So I really don't think it's that essential, but I think sometimes when you say RDL, people might be thinking of 2 different movements. But anyway, I just thought that was a potentially useful point.
So the deadlift group were advised the same, to lift in a slow and deliberate manner without explosive movements. They performed. Yeah, so okay, I'm not gonna half-ass this and just I'm trying to freestyle, because I wanted to make a point on strength and sport performance. And there is a paper by James Steele and Fisher that was published, I think 2-3 years ago, where they essentially questioned the effect of resistance training on sport performance. And although intuitively it does make sense that getting stronger, at least up to a certain extent, will transfer to sports that include strength and power, the data is not as clear as we would like it to be. And I think, I'm not saying, hey, don't do any strength training if you're an athlete, but the idea that if you get a rugby or American football player from X squad to Z squad, especially after they've reached a certain point, that their sport-specific performance will all of a sudden explode as well. I don't think that that's necessarily based on something. And it may just be that if they're doing well overall and they're healthy and they're performing well in the gym, it's just a coincidence that they're also performing well in the field, if that makes sense. That just represents that they're healthy and they're in good shape.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really interesting topic about transfer specificity and the difference between a highly trained versus a recreation trained versus non-trained person. And also the influence of morphological adaptations. Just how much does muscle mass actually contribute to it? One thing I think is really interesting, there's a meta-analysis by Schoenfeld, Gurgic, Ogborn, and Krieger from 2017, Strength and Hypertrophy Adaptations Between Low versus High Load Resistance Training, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And for the most part, this meta-analysis falls in line with what we'd expect with specificity. We see that it doesn't matter if you train with low or high loads, if you have similar set volume for hypertrophy and you're training, close to failure, which almost all the studies did that were included in this meta-analysis, almost no change. When you look at the forest plot, it looks like the effect is dead middle, the standardized mean difference. So does it favor high load or low load, which makes sense. And then exactly what you'd expect when you're looking at 1RM strength, which is typically done on free weight movements in most studies, or at least a Smith machine. You see a strong effect favoring training with heavier loads, right? Train heavier, increase your 1RM. But what I think is also really funny is interesting, I should say, is that for isometric strength changes, there was no significant difference between groups, and it was actually the similar standardized mean difference to hypertrophy, showing that once you remove a lot of the quote-unquote skill components and you just have an isolated joint movement, it doesn't seem to matter whether you're training with high or low loads, and it's more just about the effort and the volume. And it kind of, I can't conclude this, but it might even indirectly indicate that some of these early stage adaptations, because most of the participants in these studies were recreationally trained or untrained, and creating that muscle mass, it's going to be one of the primary drivers for that non-specific strength. And I think after that is maybe where this study comes in, and we start to think about all right, look, if you want to increase your sumo deadlift 1RM, we need to be doing things that are specific to a sumo deadlift 1RM. And that's not to say, okay, once you have, trained for 2 years, now you just need to work up to a max every day or anything like that. We've had conversations about specificity, you and I, Omar, where, what might be specific for one individual, like grip training or a pause deadlift to encourage the motor pattern of keeping the bar close to the shin, or, hey, someone who has a very specific technical error. There are ways to address that with a certain type of programming strategy or exercise selection or cueing, whatever. So it doesn't just mean, max out. That's that simple, bro. But it does indicate that once we're at an advanced level, you need to be very intentional with your training if you want to see it go up. And then you have to assess what's the opportunity cost, right?
And I wanted to slightly transition since I am here, not since you are here, because I am the guest, and talk about the idea of pursuing of the infinite pursuit of 1RM strength increases for individuals who may not be powerlifters and are closer to the bodybuilding side, maybe bodybuilders, but the average individual who wants to get jacked and generally strong, and just hear what you, as a bodybuilder and as a bodybuilding coach, think about the idea of how we define performance increases. Because I do feel that we now, and in the past as well, but now it's becoming a bit more popular again to chase those numbers, and the idea that if you get your deadlift or your squat or whatever movement to be stronger at the 1RM sort of level, that will instantly reflect on your physique in the form of muscle gain. And whether you think that's the best way to go about it, or at least conceptualizing it that way makes much sense.
No, that's a great question, Pak. And I think there are levels to this. And I remember in the 2010 to 2013 era, being maybe a little higher in terms of the levels that I was getting to, so having a more superficial understanding of this. And I was kind of the opinion that, look, the neuromuscular quick changes in strength are done within the first number of months or whatever. And there might be some fine-tuning skill things, but once you've locked in your movement pattern for a given lift, if you're going to get stronger, it's primarily going to come from increases in cross-sectional area, increases in muscle mass. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong. And I do think that if you could take a high-level lifter and see them get a meaningful increase in muscle size, they would get stronger. I mean, anabolic steroids, right? So, but like, if a person on anabolic steroids doesn't allow themselves to gain weight, the data, if when you just kind of look at people who don't go up a weight class versus those who do, the strength gains are far less impressive, so shout out to Greg Nuckols. He's written about this a little bit. But anyway, the point being is that even if that might be true theoretically, how much muscle mass is an advanced person going to put on? And should that be the primary strategy if your goal is to increase strength? And I actually think now that I have a deeper understanding of not just muscle physiology and muscle anatomy, but also like the muscle tendon unit architecture and all the complexity that goes into what is changing at the muscular level, adaptations to tighten, adaptations to lateral force transmission, changes in pennation angle to allow more myofibrillar packing, the fact that there are changes to other compartments of the muscle that are non-contractile, and these aren't all huge things, but individually I do think they add up. And understanding that really at a high level, powerlifters and any kind of skilled strength athlete, they are still making fine-tuned changes to their training. I think like the next level is actually neuromuscular adaptations continue for a long time and there's more finely tuned ones. But I think a level below that is we don't really know how to measure what we consider these quote unquote fine-tuned neuromuscular adaptations. Like a few years back when Lenicky and colleagues started first critiquing the idea of hypertrophy contributing to strength, they kind of went like, look, it doesn't seem to in these studies that I don't think are great studies to actually answer that question. Like a very minute change in bicep thickness over 8 weeks doesn't increase strength. Well, like, okay, if you didn't grow any muscle, we can't measure whether that lack of muscle growth increased strength. That's the main critique of some of their data. But anyway, I think the issue with that kind of their thinking wasn't necessarily the data itself, but the extrapolation of saying, therefore, it must be neuromuscular. And the reality is we don't actually know what is resulting in these increases in strength. We just know that it's not the short-term changes in hypertrophy in these studies. But when we look at long-term associations, they do seem to be related. So what I think is happening is that there are other changes that are not reflected in muscle cross-sectional area increases that lead to strength, but we need more data to understand exactly what they are. And I do think we're not giving enough respect to, I wouldn't even say neuromuscular changes, but the motor skill learning in a powerlifter who's moving from a 550 to a 570 deadlift after 10 years of training or something like that. So to bring it back to the physique athlete discussion, a 1RM strength score is probably not going to be that reflective after the very early stages of your muscle mass. It might differentiate between powerlifters, but if one of those powerlifters gets a little stronger, I don't necessarily think they got bigger.
Yeah.
So what I focus on is looking at broader metrics of performance. And I'm not alone in this. So for example, I don't necessarily agree with all the methods, all the approaches, and all the concepts that Mike Israetel and like the RP approach has.
Shots fired.
But this is, shots fired. This is big drama. But one of the things that they look at is, all right, if I'm increasing the overall stress and stimulus, I'm adding sets of 10, right, at a 2 RIR, and I'm not seeing the load on the bar go down, that's probably a good thing because I'm doing more work, creating more fatigue, but it's not dropping my performance much. I'm adapting to it. And it's essentially saying, hey, at least in the short to mid-term, I can do more total work. My volume load is going up. And I think that's one area where we sort of agree, because I do something similar. I'm not necessarily thinking about it on a week-to-week basis of, did my performance go up or down, because it could be influenced by so many things. But I absolutely am looking at, is my volume load over 3 sets on a isolated movement or a more controlled movement for a given muscle group going up over time while I'm in a caloric surplus? Is my 10 RM going up over time while I'm in a caloric surplus? Because I can't actually really evaluate muscle size changes, especially in an advanced bodybuilder who's drug-free, over a reasonable time scale. A lot of the times we're going, hey, at this body weight last prep, you look better. So it's cool. Like, I guess I'm a little bit better 3 years later. Now, that's not true for intermediates or novices. I think they absolutely can and should strive for improvements in stage weight and seeing things change over the time period of 3 to 6 months rather than 3 years. But when you are talking about, like WMDF pros who are trying to make improvements, that's primarily what we're looking at, is these broader metrics of performance across sets, mesocycle to mesocycle, 10 RMs, things like that. Not necessarily a 10 RM. And then are all the other ingredients that should be supporting that growth there.
Yep.
So we can't see the cake, but we know all the ingredients, and we're going, all right, the oven's on, right? I have enough calories to be supporting this. I've got a sufficient training program that has previously indicated I could make improvements, and I'm seeing improvements in the weight room in these broader metrics. Therefore, I'm going to keep investing in this strategy and see what happens down the line once I have a comparable set of pictures or even, measurements, sometimes whatever you want to do, or just go, all right, at this body weight, similar conditions, what am I looking like visually? So that's kind of, I think, the best we can do, unless you have like regular access to, skin fold assessments or MRI or something like that. And 99% of people don't.
Yeah. Yeah, that was very insightful. And I do think that the strength world culture has sort of affected the way physique athletes view performance increases and how they conceptualize it. Because in many circles, the idea of if you get stronger, you'll get bigger is constantly thrown out. And obviously, you do want to see performance increases, but at the same time, if you're a hypertrophy oriented athlete or individual, trying to see performance increases and defining performance as a 1 repetition maximum test on the squat, deadlift, whatever, I think, although you'll probably see some muscle gains after a point, especially if you're like an intermediate athlete, just because you'll be doing volume and you're going to be training. That's not the best way to view performance. So that's what I was getting at. And if you're just an individual who wants to be jacked and strong to a healthy point, getting your squat from 400 to 500 will not necessarily reflect positively on your health. Are you typing?
I totally
agree. Texting Omar saying this sucks? Tell him to stop talking.
Not at all. I'm looking up things that I've written about before to remind myself, just like you were earlier. But in all seriousness, I think it's important to understand practical versus theoretical differences that may be true but may not be useful. And one thing I can say is that when we start to look at just how competitive powerlifting is now, and these really impressive top specimens of strength sport, they can put on a lot more muscle mass than most of us can. And so their quote unquote advanced gains might be better than what we would get even as early stage intermediates. So their capacity to put on muscle mass is higher than ours. So I do think this relationship of just kind of dismissing the relationship between muscle mass increases and strength gains in the average person doesn't necessarily apply in all those cases. And a great example of that is Bryce Lewis going from the 93 kilo class to the 105s, right? His body fat did go up, but he went from being a good power lifter to actually winning a world championship and winning 3 national titles in pretty contested years, beating people like Ashton Rushka, Christoph Wierzbicki, Garrett Blevins. And one thing I can say is that I am next to positive that kind of leap in strength from already being elite to super elite, world champion status, did come in large part from his body going, thank you for creating the environment where I can actually make some more muscle mass gains.
Yeah.
Now, most people can't be a 105 at 5'6" and still look pretty good like Bryce did. He's obviously leaner now that he came back down to 93, but the data also bears that out. like if you were to do, and again, this is not causational research or anything like that, but Greg has looked at this. He's written about it in Mass when he was still a part of it a couple times, and he's talked about it on Stronger by Science. When you look at what happens when people go up weight classes, that seems to explain a fair amount of the increase in strength. And if it was really true that cross-sectional area just had a minuscule influence on strength, we wouldn't see these gradated relationship between weight classes. We wouldn't see, 105s being stronger than 93s and 120s being stronger than 105s. And one thing I can say is that there's many, many, many examples of lifters who are hanging around pretty lean, chilling in like the 83s, and their body just like wants to put on more muscle. I'm actually thinking of some of the folks who Alberto works with nutritionally, who are high-level IPF competitors, and they walk around 2-3 kilos over their competition weight, and they cut last minute. And he's like, you know what? If they move the weight class, I know we would see this like increase, but they don't want to be not at the top of the next weight class yet. They're not willing to take that time because right now they're winning gold medals, and like fair enough. I think it's a hard decision to make. So to like temporarily go down in placing for the possibility of maybe being better in 2 or 3 years than the rest of the field. Like Bryce did it. I think it was a good move, but it's not necessarily an easy decision to make. There's risk to it. Like, What if you're just as strong? Like, yeah, you go up 20 kilos on your total by going up 10 kilos on body weight, and now you're at the exact same, but you missed out on 1 or 2 years of winning a world championship. So anyway, the point being, I think it is different when we're looking at some of people who can just simply put on more muscle mass than us. And because they can put on 10 kilos when they've been training for 7 years and you can only put on 1, doesn't mean that muscle mass doesn't improve strength. It just means that for you, the viability of that strategy is limited. And I think that's an important point to point out.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. And it's something that anecdotally I've observed as well with lifters I've worked with. More specifically, a friend and a lifter I work with now, who's female, who was in the 57 kilo category, just moving up to the 63 kilo category and gaining about 2 or 3 kilos in body weight, instantly saw her go from a 160 kilo deadlift to a 175 kilo deadlift, which was insane. Squat and bench as well increased quite a bit, but I do think that it is powerlifters often sort of somewhat discount how powerful gaining weight after a certain point can be, especially if you've been restricting yourself to a weight class and you've been essentially maintaining your body weight for years and years. So definitely I agree there. It's just I get a bit triggered when I hear people say strength equals muscle mass versus potentially the opposite, which is what you said now, which I agree with.
Yeah, it's essentially reverse causation. People think that, okay, I have to increase my strength to get bigger. But in reality, if your strength has gone up, it may be a contributing factor that you have put on more muscle mass. And I think that is something that people need to have a clearer understanding of, because like me, there was a point in 2011 and 12 where I was thinking that way, that if I got stronger, it means I got bigger. So therefore, let me just follow. My training became lower volume and more strength specific, and my strength went up, but then it plateaued. And it plateaued for a while until what? Until I started doing more volume again. And I got substantially bigger for my 2011 contest season along the same time course when, my deadlift went from 500 to around 570. My squat went from the mid 400s to 500, and my bench went from about, 315, 325 up to like 365 at its peak when I was obviously heavier, but at the same body weight up to like 350. So those are just correlations. It's an N of 1. But there is data, like specifically to give some numbers on this, the changes in body weight on open powerlifting for people going up in strength explains about like 14% of the variability. So it's not everything, but that's meaningful, right? So going up in body weight is something that a lot of coaches recommend because it can have an impact on strength pretty reliably. It may not be the thing, and there's certainly other opportunities to go up in strength, and that only goes on to a certain point. I have absolutely seen people, and here's a good way to do this, just kind of an easy way for anyone listening or for coaches. look at your relative strength score that's relevant for your federation, whether that's good lift points, IPF points, dots, whatever. That should go up if you're doing this right, or at least stay the same. Yep. Like if you're someone who wants to be bigger and stronger and you don't really care about being more competitive as an athlete, you could at least look at kind of your gym numbers and see if your dot score has at least stayed the same. Then you've gained muscle and strength. But for a power lifter, if you know that you've put on majority muscle and it's resulting in increased strength, then you should actually see those values increase. That it was worth it for you to go up a weight class. But if it goes down, like for example, if you gain 10 kilos of body weight and your total only goes up by 10 kilos, you just become a less competitive. And you're probably looking a little fluffier, which to each their own, but I'm just saying it gives you some indication of the type of and quality of mass you put on per se.
Oh, I've been feeling guilty that I've been holding the mic all this time, so I keep passing it to Omar, and it looks like as if I'm passing it for him to hold it for me, but I'm not that bougie. Yeah, and anecdotally for myself as well, since you shared some anecdotes, my deadlift has gone up from 270 kilos to 285 in the last 3 years, but I've been doing just singles and some like very low volumes, 1RM specific training. And if my goal was to get my hamstrings and glutes and potentially erectors bigger, the fact that my deadlift has gone up by 15 kilos tells me that I probably haven't lost any muscle mass, and maybe I've made some gains. But if my sole purpose was to get bigger and get those muscle groups bigger, there's much better ways to go about it than focusing on my 1RM strength, if that makes sense, which we see quite a bit now in the natural and enhanced bodybuilding world. As it's cool to deadlift many plates, and it's cool to load a bunch of exercises with weight and be strong, but at the same time, hey, let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here.
Absolutely. Omar, in your experience, you've been in the game a while and you have actually pushed your numbers up. I would say, and correct me if you don't think this is an accurate characterization, you've probably spent most of your time in more of a powerlifting-centric strength gaining phase. I know you have dabbled in Olympic weightlifting. There was a period where we were playing around with strongman stuff, but you've been in the game just as long as I have. You've been lifting for 20 years yet?
No.
Almost?
No, it's like, what would it be? Like 15.
15? Okay.
Beginning.
You have squatted 500, you've deadlifted 600. I would say you're probably, I wouldn't say you're like peaked out, but you're probably close to your genetic potential for strength. Maybe you could get a little more. And if you were maybe a little less, if you hadn't gone through these, purposeful blocks to try to deadlift 600, to try to squat 500, to try to bench, what's your best bench? 370?
375.
375, my bad. See, that's when you know you're about it, because he quibbles over those 5 pounds. Those 5 pounds mattered. They took effort.
Well, it's just 10 more pounds than you, so every pound matters.
It is. At a lower body weight, by the way, because I was 220 pounds when I did that. So I would say that you have gone through purposeful training phases to peak those values. You've thought about it. You are intelligent. You've programmed. And I would say maybe if you didn't try quite as hard, those numbers would all be about, what do you think, 10% less?
Sure, like if I was just, let's say, power building or focusing on
just
a combination
training.
there. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, letting the strength come to you. You'd be about 10% weaker, which is still really good numbers, right? Like a 460 squat, a 550 deadlift, and like a 320, 330 bench. You basically be me. So it's very good is what I'm saying. But at a lower body weight, I'm losing this conversation. But the point is, the question is, I should say, from gaining that other 10% of strength and really getting close to your peak, did you see that come along with increases in size? Was the key for you getting bigger?
Look, you nerds are overcomplicating shit. We've known since time the weight moves weight. What are we even talking about here? No, I would say, Eric, to the point in what both of you guys were saying, some really good points brought up. There comes a time and place that what you're doing is actually only assisting in one particular goal, and the goal of maximizing strength, the amount of time and effort you have to dedicate towards it means that something else is, falling off. And so for myself, in order to really make some of those gains, and you note this, and you could kind of see how it will scale up amongst elite level lifters. I had the privilege and fortune training once again with Jess Bidner, programmed by the Eric Helms, also lifting with Jesus Olivares and his brother Pablo, as well as Michael Davis. So we're talking 3 people, that were at Sheffield. But anyways, the point is their style of training is conducive towards maximizing their strength and all the components therein. But as you seek to get stronger, and I think this distill it back down to the average listener here, it's a question of why are you doing what you're doing, and what is the actual outcome of what you're doing, the consequences of your actions. And I think to both of your points, there has been an overemphasis in certain circles in terms of what you'll get from simply pursuing strength. And as you would say, Eric, this like panacea of potential benefits. Either they'll say like, so we're joking off air about functional strength, or like the carryover towards athletic endeavors, and now quickly scale off. I mean, I can't, I'm sure you guys remember this. I can't overemphasize the amount of people that were chirping like LeBron James when he was doing a box squat with 2 plates. And they're saying, man, imagine what, like serious powerlifters were saying this, imagine what his vertical would be, or how much higher he could like dunk or whatever if he did 3 plates instead, or like John Jones's like training style, whatever, when he was doing it, as if that have any transfer to his chosen sport. But anyways, so I think we're all definitely chafing against that. Or shout out to some people that said, hey, you want big legs, just squat 500 pounds. Or you want, big pecs, to your point, Eric, like bench 315. Why bench 315 in 2012? And my pecs were not the ass chest that they became years later when I increased the volume, because I was highly specific with what I was doing. And I think there is a trade-off that occurs amongst all lifters of time and intention that you can only focus. A shout out to one of my favorite Iron Culture quotes of all time. One was Eric's, and identifying a problem is not the same as providing a solution. And another very pure economics you got from Brian Whitaker, maximizing giving the constraints, which I think frames everything, like truly, honestly. But if you have a finite amount of time, resources, and energy to dedicate towards the gym, to get, to your point, Eric, 5% stronger, whatnot, you have to spend a disproportionate amount of time doing that. And as you get closer to your theoretical threshold, that'll become more and more important. All that to say, I guess, boys, we're really not about that life, because I am enjoying pursuing getting stronger. And shout out to Kyriakos, because he is someone who is about that life. You need to live it. I don't know if both of you guys saw, he did curl more than Levon, who is like the best arm wrestler currently, and Denis Siplinkov. He curled 315, I think, was it 6 or 7 reps, and Levon did it for like 3 or 4, and it looked the same difficulty for Grizzly. So maybe the secret is that we haven't bulked enough.
And also, aside from the juicy Grizzly info, which is that Grizzly hasn't been training with a barbell for the last few years, and he's been primarily doing pulls and other stuff. Just fun fact, what Omar mentioned and what you alluded to as well, with strength increase over time and spending a lot of time to get just a bit stronger. Like we have data out there. So a study that was led by Christopher Latella, which is available as a preprint. I think you've seen it. I think I've sent it over, called Longitudinal Growth Modeling of Strength Adaptations in Powerlifting Athletes Across Ages in Males and Females. So over essentially looking at strength gains over time in powerlifters, right, from openpowerlifting.org data. So the greatest strength gains were in the earliest phase of powerlifting participation, so around 7.5 to 12.5 increase in the first year, and then only seeing that level of an increase over the next 10 years. So we are talking about increases.
Is that percentage?
Yeah, percentage over baseline. And just because I did mention it before, and you did mention the LeBron James anecdote, I guess that's what you'd call it. The paper by James on sport performance is called "Does Increasing an Athlete's Strength Improve Sports Performance? A Critical Review with Suggestion to Help Answer This and Other Causal Questions in Sports Science," which essentially found that muscular strength, there's insufficient evidence to make a definitive statement regarding the causal effect of muscular strength upon sports performance. Not to throw any shade on anyone, but the idea that, hey, if LeBron James squatted 500, he'd be a better athlete. I don't know. I'm not necessarily buying it. And, as UFC enthusiasts here, I'm a casual, but Omar is a proper enthusiast. Like, you see in those strength sports as well that, the Omar's bench press may be stronger than that of a similar body weight male, but they're
getting knocked out.
Yeah, he's getting knocked out, and yeah. Anyways, that was a silly
I
anecdote.
think it's a great point, and I think it's also really important to contextualize the way we view numbers when we see them in relative terms reported in research versus when we see them done by people. We disproportionately weight smaller changes at a higher level. So, for example, just using the numbers you actually had there, let's say somebody increased their strength 15% in their first couple of years. And then over the next years, they increased it another 10%. Okay. Let's say they're a 66 kilo lifter, right? And they started at a 500 kilo total, which is, a pretty good starting point for the first time you compete in the 66 kilo class. Like the highest totals in the 66 kilo class are right around 700. There's only like maybe 3 or 4 people in the world who can do drug-free, raw, a 700 kilo total in the 66 class. So 500 is nothing to sneeze at, okay? So if you increase your total 15%, you're now going up a fair bit. You're now into the mid to high 500s, right? And then if you increase it over the next 10 years, another 10%, now you're into the 600s, and now you're like top 10 at Worlds, right? And seeing someone go from crossing the 600 kilo barrier, or if you just kick them up another 50 kilos from the starting point, now they're actually someone who is podiuming at Worlds, and they only made that same 10% increase in the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years that got them to be that elite level lifter. But we view it differently. And we're like, no. Like that data is bullshit because I saw this lifter move from a 550 total to 610 and they won the 59s or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but that's still just a 10% increase. You're just thinking about adding 50 kilos on a total, and the fact that it moved them from being like 15th in the world to second, third, or first. And that is just an important caveat for us to understand when we're looking at data and how things feel or how we perceive them and how we assess them. And sometimes I wouldn't say an irrational way, but a disproportionate way, depending upon the context. And also I would point out that also tells you the data can only be so useful. So like, if you frame it this way, why would you double your volume to only increase your total by 10 kilos and likely risk more injury? Lol. Yeah, that's a terrible proposition for the average person who doesn't even compete in powerlifting. But that's literally exactly what I've done with Jess Bittner over the last, not doubling her volume, over the last, week since Sheffield, because increasing her total by 10 kilos could be the difference between her getting bronze or silver or a gold medal and winning her third open world championship, because she's got to go against someone like Carlina Tongotea and also Agata Shitko, who are all totaling, depending upon the day, between 580 to 600 kilos. So 5 kilos matters, 2.5 kilos matters at this level. And if you were to ask any 3 of those women, would you add 40% volume for a 2.5 increase kilo to your total? If we could say that there's a good chance you wouldn't get hurt, or at least not too badly hurt, they would say yes. So it is a different assessment of the meaning and the context of this information depending upon the person. And I think that's just a really key point. And that's the last thing I've got to say. Pak, is there anything else you want to add on this topic before we wrap it up?
No, aside from agreeing with the definition of meaningfulness, and we discussed that in detail on the minimum dose episode as well, with differentiating between statistical significance and meaningfulness in the field. If you were to ask me as well, because if I would triple my volume to get a 10 kilo increase on my deadlift, and if you said it's guaranteed that you're going to get a 10 kilo increase on my deadlift, I would do it, even though that percentage-wise is a relatively small increase.
I disagree because you don't have the time for that. Your wife would be mad. You wouldn't have the travel schedule, so maybe double. But I'm not going to give you a triple your volume. You're too well of a balanced individual for that, despite that sexy tracksuit, that Balkan appearance of doing anything for the gains.
RascalApparel.com. Buy stuff now. Omar said to 100%. Not say it, but I'm saying it. Buy stuff.
I'm also wearing a Rascal Apparel shirt and tights, and I'm going to go hit some PRs. Ooh, that's not true. I'm going to go hit some maxes shortly after this. That'll be PRs at this body weight.
Well, hey, shout out to Mass Monthly Application in Strength Sports, which is the premier research review. Top link, Kai, shout out to you. Everyone should check it out. Last thing, Eric, I thought those were some sensational points. What is meaningful to any individual is, of course, highly personal and subjective. And that's how we make those choices, where for many of us, the pursuit of 5 kg, it's not the kg, it's the journey that really frames it. And it's not the weight you're lifting so much as the story that's told. And all this is a major cope of saying that, damn it, I'm that guy from that wrestling meme where he says, I just want to say what y'all do to your body. And then he starts breaking down. He's like, it's still real to me. The pursuit of these things can be beautiful. You just have to understand it. And I think the best way, you need to live it. The best way to frame it in my head that has helped me too is that, of course, if you don't get the outcome that you desire, and I think for a lot of us, it's not only the lack of the percentage change, but it's the uncertainty that we're dealing with. So it's not just the 5 kg for all of us who've been training now for a long period of time. What if you don't get it? And if you accept that that's not only a possibility, but that might be an outcome, and you're okay with that outcome, not that you desire it, but that you wouldn't view your training for that year as being meaningless if you don't attain said goal, then it's fine. But I think it's when, to all of our points, when we try and pursue something and we think, oh, we're going to become an amazing fighter as a result of doing this, we're going to get more swole than ever before, our following is going to increase, all these things. When we over-attribute, that's when it gets dangerous.
Well said, sir.
Well, Pak, where can people find you? Thank you so much for being on. We had to fly him all the way here. He said, after the first time we had him, and I felt terrible due to my internet connection, where he had all these personal references of like either watching the channel, Iron Culture, yourself, and the internet connection was so shit that it really didn't, hit, that I had to fly him all the way from Greece, not the UK, here to Toronto to do this one. So thank you so much. Where can people find you?
In Greece. No, just kidding. They can find me on Instagram, and who cares? Just listen to Iron Culture. You don't need to worry much about me. But I assume my socials will be in the description, aka Instagram.
But also check the description because I'm there and I need your follow.
Buy Rascal Apparel. Send me money. Thank you. Peace.
Eric, the crypto god, has spoken. I want to thank every single person for listening to another express episode of Iron Culture, not because certain individuals did not show up on time, but simply because we knew we could cover the topic in only an hour of power. Thank you so much, so much for watching another episode of Iron Culture. You could go ahead and leave a rating review. 5 stars is typically what people will leave, although I do enjoy reading the 1 star. Whatever, there were a few more ones. We'll read that in the next episode. Thank you so much. We're back every single insert date here, and we'll catch you in that next episode.